decades, I knew very little about Jack the Ripper, other than the idea was society's metaphor for everything we find mysterious, unthinkable, unsolvable, and reluctantly fascinating. To do your duty, you must free your mind of any articles, books, or movies you may have read or seen regarding Jack the Ripper. Anything which would interfere with the evidence I'm about to present.
At 3:40 a.m. on August 31st, 1888, Charles Lechmere was on his way to work in Whitechapel, London, when he stumbled upon a woman's body on the pavement. Assuming she was drunk, he was hesitant to help her, until Robert Paul emerged from the fog. They debated helping her, but finally decided to find assistance. Then PC John Neal arrived with a lantern that revealed something weird. What the previous two gentlemen had failed to notice in the dark was that there was a dark pool of blood beneath the woman's neck. She wasn't passed out drunk. She was dead. Unknown to them, this marked the beginning of Jack the Ripper's reign of terror. Over 70 days, London was gripped by fear as the Ripper claimed 4 more victims, mutilating their bodies with shocking brutality. Then, just as suddenly, the killing stopped. The last victim was buried over 130 years ago, but the mystery endures. How did the Ripper evade capture? Why did the murders suddenly stop? And most importantly, who was Jack the Ripper? So here's the deal. Jack's true identity has been a mystery for decades, but if you stick around to the end, I have a very, very strong candidate to tell you about. One who isn't usually even mentioned when people talk about Jack the Ripper. But before getting into his identity, it is first important to understand his victims. All 5 of them. The first victim found by Charles Lechmere and Robert Paul was Mary Ann Nichols. She had her neck severed by 2 deep cuts, and her body bore multiple stab wounds. The brutality had just begun. A week later, Annie Chapman's mutilated body was discovered on Hanbury Street. Her throat was also cut, but this time her internal organs were removed and arranged around her body. In just 9 days, 2 women had been brutally murdered. 12 days later, 2 more victims met their fate within an hour of each other. Elizabeth Stride had her throat cut, but her body was untouched, suggesting the killer was interrupted. So the Ripper took it out on Catherine Eddowes. Her body was horrifically mutilated, her face disfigured, and organs removed. She was missing a kidney, which the Ripper had sent along with one of the many letters he sent to the media and police. It was half-eaten, and the killer even declared it in the letter. The final and most devastating act was the murder of Mary Jane Kelly on November 9th. Unlike the others, she was killed indoors, allowing the Ripper ample time to indulge his gruesome fantasies. Her body was so severely mutilated that even her own mother would not have recognized her. Now, pictures do exist of these crime scenes, but they come with serious warnings. They are some of the most disturbing ever captured on film, and once seen, they can never be unseen. By this point in our story, the London police force were in the midst of the biggest manhunt. Thousands of Londoners were interviewed, 300 suspects investigated, and over 80 people questioned. Yet no one was ever convicted, making these crimes possibly the world's most famous cold case. Over the years, around 500 people have been accused of being Jack the Ripper, some theories being quite outlandish. One theory claims Prince Albert, Queen Victoria's grandson, was the Ripper. The theory suggests that the murders was him eliminating those who knew of his illegitimate child with a Whitechapel prostitute. Another theory suggests Lewis Carroll, author of Alice in Wonderland, was the killer. The reasoning behind this theory is initially compelling. Author Richard Wallace claimed that if you rearrange letters in certain sections of Carroll's poems, they spelled out a detailed confession of his guilt. This is true. There is a hidden confession in Carroll's poems. However, if you take a long enough passage from any book, you can scramble the letters to say anything you like. Critics of Wallace's work humorously proved this by rearranging the first lines of his book to spell out a confession that he'd framed O.J. Simpson and secretly written Shakespeare's sonnets. So far, these suspects didn't fit the Ripper's profile, The Ripper's murders were tightly grouped within a mile in Whitechapel, indicating he was likely a local. He had some sort of motive since all his victims were prostitutes. He was once known as Leather Apron, a name given by Whitechapel's prostitutes to a mysterious man who threatened them. This man was identified as John Picer, a local bootmaker with a violent past. Despite seeming a perfect suspect, Picer had alibis for not one but two of the murders. Another common suspect is James Maybrick, a prominent Liverpool cotton merchant murdered by his wife soon after the last Ripper victim. Maybe she discovered he was a killer and decided to kill him before she became his next victim. The key piece of evidence against Maybrick is a diary published in 1992, found by a Liverpool scrap metal dealer named Michael Barrett. The diary detailed all 5 Ripper murders and 2 others. Though the diary's sudden appearance raised suspicions, initial tests showed it was written in a genuine Victorian notebook with Victorian ink. It contained details consistent with Maybrick's life. But just as the case seemed close to resolution, Barrett confessed to forging the diary with his wife. However, some Ripperologists, yes, that's a thing, some Ripperologists still believe Maybrick was the killer. In 1993, a Victorian pocket watch was discovered with Maybrick's name, the initials of the Ripper's 5 victims, and the words, "I am Jack," engraved inside. Experts concluded the watch and engravings were several decades old, adding to the enigma since Maybrick wasn't suspected until the diary's discovery. Could Maybrick have been the killer? Let me know what you think in the comments. You're probably starting to see a pattern here. For every plausible candidate, there's an equally plausible reason why they were not Jack the Ripper. This holds true for almost every suspect, but not all. Jack the Ripper's elusiveness is legendary, so it's fitting he might have been hiding in plain sight for over a century. This man wasn't a prince, a famous author, or a wealthy aristocrat. He was as ordinary as they come, so inconspicuous that he's already appeared in this video and you probably didn't give him a second glance. Any guesses? Let's go back to the Ripper's first victim, Mary Ann Nichols. Did you notice anything strange about her murder? Unlike most victims, her body was left relatively unmolested, at least by Jack the Ripper standards, and the killer took the time to cover up most of her injuries beneath her clothes, while every other victim was left quite deliberately on display. Traditionally, Ripper researchers have assumed Mary's murder was slightly less brutal than the others, because Jack was still learning his trade, and that's certainly a possibility. But what if the mutilations were less severe because, just like the third murder, the killer never got the chance to finish them? I started this video by telling you that Charles Lechmere stumbled across Mary's body on his way to work, just as the police report states. But let's imagine the scene from Robert Paul's perspective. Paul arrived to find Lechmere standing over the body of a murdered woman. If he was the Ripper, then he had a split-second decision when he heard Paul approaching: to run or stay put and pretend to have just found the body. Interestingly, Lechmere was reluctant to move the body, which was also noted in the police report. If he was the killer, he would have known that moving Mary would clearly reveal she had been murdered. Lechmere kept a low profile after the murder. He didn't come forward to give evidence at the inquest until Robert Paul mentioned him to the press. Even then, he gave his evidence under a different name, Charles Cross. Here's another angle. His address was 22 Doveton Street, and he worked as a meat cart driver for a local company called Pickford's. It isn't much to go on, but even these scant details are intriguing. As a meat cart driver, Lechmere would have frequently handled animal carcasses, providing a plausible reason for wandering about with blood on his clothes. Additionally, if you map his likely route to work based on his home address and the address of his employer, it's evident he would have passed conveniently close to the locations of at least 3 Whitechapel murders in the early hours of the morning, exactly when all the Ripper victims were found. Had anyone suspected Lechmere 130 years ago, the case might have been solved, and Jack the Ripper would not remain a mystery today. Unfortunately, that suspicion never arose, and we lack sufficient evidence to draw definitive conclusions. As frustrating as that is, these huge evidential blind spots are a big part of what makes the story of Jack the Ripper so compelling even today. Lechmere may well have been the killer, but we can't rule out the possibility that he was just an unlucky guy who found a dead body on his way to work. Someone had to, and a man living and working in Whitechapel was more likely to stumble upon such a scene than most. Whatever the truth, These were some of the most brutal and disturbing crimes ever committed, and yet whoever carried them out got away scot-free. If that doesn't creep you out, I guess nothing ever will. Thanks for joining me here today. As usual, please remember to hit the subscribe button and like this video. Till next time, Sticky out.